Well, welcome everybody to our We Extra webinar in our joint series of APRS and Planning Democracies series on biodiversity and planning, which we started last year actually. So if you want to watch others in the series, I think Nikki is just putting a link into the chat, or Laura is, and you can access the previous webinar series from those. So today we're going to be having two excellent speakers, and they will speak for 20 minutes each, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end. So if you would like to put any of those questions into the chat, that makes it easier when the numbers are quite good, and it makes it easier for us. So as most of you will know, Planning Democracy campaign for a better planning system in Scotland that takes care of both the planet and people, and APRS campaign on greenbelt and countryside issues. And we've been running this joint series of webinars in order to upskill as many people as possible to understand how communities can be better involved in making sure planning delivers on its biodiversity and nature commitments. And one really important element that we think offers opportunities for people to do this, especially where there are new housing developments, and that's through sustainable urban drainage systems, or SUDS. And this is a pretty new area for me, so I'm really looking forward to hearing from Craig McAdam, who is the co-leader and director of conservation at Buglife, which is an invertebrate conservation trust, as you might guess from the name. And Craig has spent 11 years in the Scottish water industry, and he now oversees Buglife's conservation advocacy and planning work. And he's a freshwater specialist with a particular interest in less well-known species and overlooked habitats. So we're going to hear from him first, and then I'll introduce our second speaker once he's finished. So Craig, take it away.
Oh yeah, thank you, Claire. I'll just share my screen and do the necessary movements of things out of the way so I can see what I'm doing. How do I move that? Yeah, I'll move that one over there. And that's brilliant. I think that's me ready to go. Well, thank you for inviting me to present here. My name's Craig McAdam, as Claire said, and I'm co-leader and director of conservation with Buglife, the Invertebrate Conservation Trust. And for those of you that haven't heard about Buglife before, we're the only organisation in Europe concerned with the conservation of all invertebrates. From spiders to starfish, mayflies to millipedes, we undertake practical action to help these species. We raise awareness of invertebrates and their habitats and provide a voice for invertebrates through our advocacy work. Our aim is to halt invertebrate extinctions and to achieve sustainable populations of invertebrates. Before we move on to my talk, I have a confession to make. And as Claire alluded to there, I had 11 years in the water industry in Scotland. Whilst I've been studying invertebrates for over 35 years, I actually trained as a civil engineer and worked for 4 years in actually designing drainage systems. So this was back in the mid to late 1990s when SUDS were just coming in. So, you know, I was actually designing these things once in a while ago. I also discovered that I take a lot of pictures of SUDS. When I was looking for pictures of this, I had loads to choose from. So here goes. So this evening, I'm going to be talking about how we manage surface water in Scotland. And to give some context, I thought it would be useful to look at the climate that we're living in. We all know that Scotland is famous for its rain. I think it's just about to rain here again today. But climate projections shown here suggest that it's going to get, our winters in particular, are going to get milder and a lot wetter. And that means we're likely to see more views like this. And making sure new developments are sited in the right location, for example, not on a floodplain like this photo shows, and ensuring that surface water is managed correctly is going to be absolutely essential. This evening, I'm going to talk to you about the history of surface water management in Scotland and the use of SUDS in developments, and then show you some examples of good and bad designs. So what are SUDS? Well, SUDS are sustainable urban drainage systems. Urban's in brackets there because they don't have to be in urban areas. There's a lot of SUDS that are along the trunk road network to manage surface water off roads and things now. But when they were first brought in, they were primarily urban systems. They manage surface water by mimicking natural processes, and that's the key. It's about the natural processes. It's not a treatment works. It's not a, it's not using chemicals. It's a natural process that it's using. And they can take many different forms. For example, green roofs and living roofs. These are vegetated areas on the top of roofs that are installed. They hold up the water, they slow the flow of the water, they do a bit of purification. They have other benefits. They insulate the house or the building, in this case a school, and they will keep it cool during the summer and warm during the winter. But the main thing they're doing is slowing the flow of water to the surface water drains. Similar thing with living walls, sort of green walls. These are slowing the flow of water down from the gutters into the drainage system, which is at the bottom of this wall here. Green swales and filter strips. These are open channels that are vegetated, and instead of the water running down that road there and down into a gully and into the surface water drains directly, the water flows down this channel and it will be held up there. It will slow it getting to the river or to the drain, and it will evaporate off or percolate into the soils. And then we have the classic thing that people think of SUDS, which is the detention basins, these ponds. And they can either be wet, like this one in the picture, or they could be dry. And I'll show you some examples of them later on. And these hold up the water again. Any pollutants are drop out of it into the sediments. The water's held up, and then it's slowly let back into the drain or into the water course. And we can have constructed wetlands. These again can be wet or dry. And this is a dry example, which will fill up with water when it rains. The water will be held there. It'll evaporate off, or it'll percolate through the gravel on the base. And then finally, you get small-scale modular features. These are often called rain gardens. They're an extension of the idea of a water butt. So a water butt was to hold rainwater so you could use it in your garden. Well, this larger structure has gravels and other material in it, and then a wetland vegetation. And the water goes in there, it's held in there, and then it slowly trickles back into the drain after the heavy rain has passed. So the history of SUDS in Scotland, as I said, I was involved in the water industry back in the 1990s. And I was fortunate enough to be able to see the advent of SUDS in Scotland. It was pioneering work by Brian Darcy at the Forth River Purification Board, who championed the idea of SUDS and has done a lot of the work on SUDS in his time at FRPB and at SEPA and since then. To give you the background, the Control of Pollution Act 1974 set out the provisions for wastewater disposal and water pollution. It didn't really talk about flooding and surface water. What we had to wait for the Environment Act in 1995, which established SEPA, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, and transferred the responsibility for flood warning and water pollution to them, water pollution monitoring, sorry, to them. So that was, before then we had the river purification boards that covered all this. It then moved to this single entity, which was SEPA. In 1997, there were two pieces of legislation that came in, the Flood Prevention and Land Drainage Act, which established local authorities as responsible for flood prevention. So you had SEPA responsible for flood warning and the local authority responsible for flood prevention in their areas. And the Town and Country Planning Act, which set out the process for development control. I worked in a regional council, and when I started in 1991, we were responsible for looking at flooding in the area. We had a flood officer, we had a flood team who did engineering solutions to flooding, like building bigger walls and clearing out rivers and things. In 1997, that changed, and we moved from regional councils to 3 water boards in Scotland, and they lost the flooding element, and it went to the local authorities. The big game changer for the water environment in the UK and across Europe was the EU Water Framework Directive, which came in 2000. It set targets for reducing water pollution, including diffuse pollution, which meant it had to deal with surface water drainage that was bringing pollutants from urban areas. Around about that time, Syria, this construction industry research, can't remember what that IE stands for, but they published guidance on how to design SUDS and how SUDS could be incorporated into drainage schemes, which again was really, the Forth River Board had done a lot of this in the past, and Brian Darcy had led on that, but this was bringing it into the mainstream, if you pardon the pun. The Water Industry Act in 2002, that established Scottish Water as the single water authority in Scotland responsible for water treatment and supply and wastewater collection and treatment. Local authorities were still responsible for flood management. But Scottish Water were responsible for drainage, which meant that they were responsible for both foul sewers and surface water sewers. So in this, SUDS were then starting to be incorporated into the work of Scottish Water as well. And eventually, quite a lot of them would be adopted by Scottish Water. The Water Environment and Water Services Act in 2003, the WOOS Act, this introduced SUDS as a legal requirement to tackle water quality, so surface water quality. So this was bringing not just the slowing the flow and stopping flooding, but actually tackling water quality as well. And the building regs the year after had an inclusion of SUDS as well, which was again just bringing it into the everyday for development. Year after that, in 2005, the Water Environment Controlled Activities regs came in, and Scottish Water published the Sewers for Scotland, which included the engineering specifications for SUDS. How do you actually design a SUDS? And then in 2009, last piece of legislation that I'll throw up here is the Flood Risk Management Act. It spawned a lot of different other actions. Local authorities were required to have a register of SUDS in the area. They had to prepare surface water management plans. There was guidance produced for SUDS for roads, which tackled surface water drainage from roads network. There was retrofitting of SUDS to address flood risk. So instead of just being in new developments, you could put them in existing developments and in existing areas to manage that surface water. And the Scottish Government published management planning guidance on how to manage surface water. So quite a long history, and things have definitely changed over the years. The functions of a SUDS can be described using the SUDS triangle, which Brian Darcy produced in 1998. SUDS have 3 main functions. The first is to slow the flow of water by reducing the quantity of water flowing to rivers in times of flood. The second is to remove pollutants from surface water before it enters a watercourse. And the final thing was to provide amenity and biodiversity. So these are the 3 pillars of SUDS design. The first 2 functions are engineering functions. The third is an ecological function. And what I always ask myself is, why aren't ecologists involved in the design if there is an ecological function to them? Taking that third function and looking more at the ecological considerations required, we can use a different triangle. We can use this habitats triangle. So a good habitat for insects, invertebrates, or any other wildlife is somewhere where the species can breed, somewhere where the adults and the young can shelter, and somewhere where there is sufficient food for both adults and young, because that's often different, particularly in insects. Okay, that's a lot of talk about legislation and theory. Let's have a look at some SUDS. This first example is in Bannockburn and is a dry detention or attenuation basin. Now, most people would think this was a park, and if it flooded, they'd probably complain to the local authority, but it's designed to flood. I've never seen it flood, and I've been in this area for 30 years or something, never seen it flood. However, if you look closely, there's these three pipes leading from a surface water pumping station into this area. If the pumping station is overwhelmed, it'll overflow and into this area where it'll either evaporate, the water will either evaporate or it'll soak into the ground. If the flow is really significant, if it's a major event or there's a problem at the surface water pumping station, there's an overflow on the other side of the basin. So this SUDS ticks the water quantity box. It's going to slow the flow of water getting to the river. It's probably going to do a bit of water quality stuff as well. But it's an ecological desert. Closely mown grass, no shelter, no flowers as food plants for insects. There's nothing here that's going to help biodiversity. Here's another detention basin, this time a wet one at the Falkirk Stadium. You can see it's an engineering structure by the straight lines and the liberal use of stone-filled gabion baskets. It's such a delight to look at, isn't it? If the reeds and bulrush hadn't started to establish on the far side, this would just resemble an Olympic-sized swimming pool. It is just an engineering structure. No thought has gone into this at all. Another dry detention basin here in Carron in Falkirk. The engineering is prominently on show here with the structures, up there and large. But again, there's a little bit of architectural sort of like wiggle in the middle there, but there's little ecological consideration in the design. Now this is starting to look a bit better. This is in Kinnaird Village near Falkirk, and quite a few of the examples are there because there's a lot of different SUDS designs in this large development. This is a detention basin, a wet one. It's permanently wet. It's got scalloped edges, some marginal vegetation, relatively flat sloping sides. That's all good ticks for aesthetics and partly for biodiversity. It's visually appealing, it's in the centre of the development, and it provides habitat for larval stages of aquatic insects such as hoverflies and so on. But there's no flowers here for the adults to feed from. It's mown short all the way around it. There may be some flowers in the gardens, but there's very little food here for the adult insects. Here's another detention basin in Kinnaird Village. This one was this photo was taken back in 2008 when they were building the estate. Look at the steep sides on this. This has definitely been designed by an engineer. They've got in there with their digger and they've made it into the biggest tank that they can possibly make. If we roll on to 2000 to this year, 17 years later, the SUDS has matured. And it has got marginal vegetation, but the water's deep, the sides are steep, and many invertebrates aren't going to be able to live here. And amphibians are going to have a problem. Frogs and toads are going to have a problem getting in and out of this. Before I show you some better examples of SUDS design and management, I want to just talk about some bad management. This is the same one we've just seen in that other picture. But too many of these sites are managed by exception. So this is a really good example of that. The grounds maintenance team in this estate have cut the banks of the SUDS to within an inch of its life. But there's a swan there. We can't disturb the swan, so we'll just leave that bit uncut. We shouldn't have to have a swan in a nest to manage for wildlife. We should be doing that as a matter of course. We could be leaving these areas uncut, cutting them maybe once or twice a year, but focusing, having the exception not on wildlife, but on the engineering structures. So cutting around the inlets and the outlets and any control structures. So keeping them clear. Contrast that image with this small SUDS at the back of the houses in Kinnaird Village. You can still see that it's an engineering structure, but handrails in the bottom right of the image. But this one is managed more sympathetically for wildlife. There are bulrushes and other emergent aquatic plants in the basin, and the surrounds have flowering plants such as knapweed, thistles, cuckoo flower, ragwort, which are perfect for pollinators. Of course, this SUDS will need maintenance in the future to ensure that it doesn't succeed to woodland. There's already some willows creeping in there. But that can also be done in a sympathetic fashion, opening up just a small area, maybe a third of the pond at a time over a cycle of maintenance. Here's another SUDS in a newer part of Kinnaird Village. Whilst it's a bit too circular, there is a mix of vegetation, and the water has deep and shallow parts. There's shallow sides to it, so things can get in and out. There's emergent and floating vegetation providing a variety of places for wildlife to shelter. But it still has short-mown grass around it. Where are the flowers? Where's the food for the pollinators? I'd like to finish with what could be a perfect example of a SUDS. This is the rain garden in Zetland Park, Grangemouth, which slows the flow of water to the Grange Burn. The Grange Burn has a problem with flooding, and there's a lot of it's a very flat water course, flat gradient, and it gets a lot of water from the surrounding area. So this was put in by the local community as part of a Nature Restoration Fund project to slow the flow of the water to the Grange Burn, and just to do that little bit to help with the flooding in the area. It's located in an old rose garden in the park, and it comprises a gravel channel which has been planted up with a variety of water-loving plants and nectar sources. In times of flood, the water, they've redirected the surface water drains into this area, so it will fill it with water, and it will stay there. Again, it can percolate into the soil, or it can evaporate off. And if there's too much water, it will overflow into the burn. What it does is it slows the flow. But it's not only effective at managing the surface water, it's attractive too. And even without any water in the garden, it's busy with bees, butterflies, and birds. There were people sitting at the side of this, just enjoying it. But most importantly, there's an interpretation board there to explain to visitors what is happening here and why it's important. None of the other examples I've shown in this talk have any interpretation apart from do not enter, deep water, stay out, you might die. They're all fenced off, out of bounds, because they're managed as engineering structures. Here, instead, they explain the engineering. They show how important nature-based solutions are to mitigate the effects of a changing climate. It's a really good example of how to sell an engineering solution. So going back to my first example in Bannockburn, mown on a regular basis, this is an urban desert that holds little value for wildlife. Why couldn't it be like this area in Grangepans in Bo'ness, which BugLife created as part of the Inner Forth project? Or this area in Camelin, created through the Falkirk Pollinator Way project. These areas still need managed, but instead of fortnightly mowing to maintain a short sward, these areas are managed as grasslands, because that's what these are. These are grasslands. They're managed with a spring and autumn cut, with all the arisings removed to reduce the nutrients and to maintain the floral diversity. It cut down on the management costs, it creates a more visually appealing area, and it provides food and shelter for pollinators and other wildlife. So to summarise, SUDS are important blue-green features in the urban areas, but it's important to design biodiversity in from the start to ensure that they provide the habitat and resources for all stages of the life cycle of insects and other wildlife. Importantly, the grassy areas of these SUDS should be maintained as grassland, with cutting once or twice a year and the risings removed from the site. Engineering structures such as inlets and overflows can be trimmed and cleared more often, but the main bulk of that grass should be managed as grassland, because that's what it is. It's important to provide interpretation at these sites to explain what they are and to explain why they're being managed as they are, and also to dissuade homeowners from pouring oils and detergents, etc., down the surface water drains. You will spoil this this habitat in your development. And finally, you should enjoy them. Enjoy the dragonflies and damselflies hunting over the surface. Enjoy the butterflies flitting from flower to flower. Enjoy the evening dance of mayflies over the water. Just enjoy them. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. That was a fascinating talk and really, really useful. So we're going to be passing on to Andrada. Now, I don't know whether it's Opri or Opris now, I realise. But anyway, Andrada, most welcome. Andrada is a researcher at Edinburgh Napier University, and she's going to be showing us some of her findings from her studies of 60 SUDS across Scotland's central belt. And her research is looking into how SUDS can support pollinator communities and what design choices can make the biggest difference for nature. So her research is helping to shape national policy. So hopefully it will manage to shape the way housing developments are built near you. But one of the questions I will be asking at the end to prepare Craig for this is, how do we get communities involved and in the management and asking how to improve SUDS in their area? How do people go about that? So Andrada, please start your talk. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Claire. Cheers. I'll just share my screen quickly. Let me know if you can see that. I think it's just starting. Hide this away. Can you see that okay?
Yep, that's great.
Perfect, thank you. So I just want to give a wee background on the state of biodiversity in general. And so we know that urban areas, of course, where most of us live, is where the human and the natural ecosystems collide. And right now, there's about half of the world population living in urban areas. By 2050, that's predicted to rise to 67%, and in the UK, that's at 80% already. So of course, this rapid urbanization puts enormous pressure on our local ecosystems, and as cities expand, we will see land use change, habitat loss, fragmentation, and that of course displaces native species and can disrupt essential ecosystem services like pollination or water purification. And this is, of course, the case around the globe. Like, we're losing freshwater biodiversity due to pollution and land use change and so on. And even here in the UK, there's been, like Craig said, a lot of improvements in terms of urban water management. But ponds, specifically, they've been in long-term decline in the UK, and that's happened over the last century. And ponds are actually not small players in the biodiversity story. So they've actually showed they can support higher proportions of unique species compared to even rivers or lakes. So if they're managed for biodiversity or with biodiversity in mind, we know that urban ponds can actually host similar levels of invertebrate species as non-urban ponds. But of course, they can make a real contribution to that regional biodiversity then. So could SUDS, in addition to their water management roles, we know they've been designed for water management. Here's the SUDS triangle that Craig mentioned as well. Could SUDS provide also an opportunity to support biodiverse communities as well? So this question, I think, is especially relevant here in Scotland because this is where we've seen a very rapid increase in SUDS, in the number of SUDS ponds, especially in residential areas over the past decades. So Craig mentioned the biodiversity being the most overlooked aspect of the SUDS triangle, but so is amenity as well. And we've been having this very limited understanding of the biodiversity component in general and just how well they can function at their best as urban green infrastructure, and not just for humans, but for wildlife as well. But actually, there's a very large body of research that shows from Australia and North America that shows that stormwater retention ponds, and that's what they call them there, they can actually support diverse ecological communities. And they found that just the simple design tweaks like meandering edges or just adding stones or dead wood or different vegetation bits, they can significantly improve SUDS as habitats. But here's the key. The benefits only come with active intentional design and ongoing management as well. So just to tell you a bit about my PhD as well. So it looks to make the connection between these aquatic habitats and the biodiversity values that they could offer. So we know that the SUDS might represent an ongoing resource for urban biodiversity, but their role in pollination specifically has not been evaluated, has not been assessed. And we know that now more than ever it's critical to understand how pollinators are using the urban space, and if SUDS can provide any form of habitat for pollinators, then it's very useful to know. So for pollinators specifically, we know that globally they're under pressure from two big drivers, and that's from land use change and from climate-induced shifts in phenology, and that's the mismatch of when certain flowers emerge and when the pollinators emerge. They just don't match anymore. And of course, the pollinator strategy for Scotland here on screen and the EU biodiversity strategy, they both highlight the importance of reversing pollinator decline, first of all, and they call for more wildflower-rich areas to reduce pesticide use and to integrate invertebrate conservation into management plans in both urban and rural areas. So, of course, you can imagine a lot of this research has focused on bees as the most important pollinators, but amongst very prominent pollinators are hoverflies. So hoverflies, my personal favorite, they're also called flower flies. This is family Syrphidae. They're flies, family order Diptera. So just for context, there's about 6,000 species of hoverflies globally, and Britain has about 280. Some hoverflies are incredibly common, others quite rare, and you probably see them without realizing in your gardens. Many of them mimic bees and wasps in coloring, but of course they don't sting. They're just flies, and that what's often overlooked is just how valuable hoverflies are for pollination. So we know they contribute to about 72% of our global food crops, and that's estimated to be about 300 billion US dollars per year. But of course, hoverflies do things that bees can't. For example, because some of them are migrants, long distance pollen transfer, and they're also involved in organic matter cycling or natural pest controls. You might have seen the hoverfly larvae feeding on aphids in your gardens. So their life cycle is very, very simple, 4 stages: egg, larva, pupa, and adult. Some larvae can feed on plants, some feed on animals, and some feed on decaying material, the organic matter. But one of the stars of today's talk will be the dronefly, Eristallis tenax. You can see it here on screen, the adult and the larva. So the larva, they feed on decaying organic matter. They're typically found on just compost heaps, manure piles, and just stagnant, polluted water. I know that sounds charming, but their larvae are commonly known as the rat-tailed maggots. You might have seen them in your gardens as well. So they have this very long breathing tube. It's called a siphon, and they basically use it as a snorkeling tube to breathe underwater in very filthy waters. So of course, that's where our SUDS come in. So my PhD, I want to understand essentially what SUDS features influence hoverfly communities, like how we can design them to support hoverflies and of course other pollinators as well. So I'm sampling over 60 sites across the central belt of Scotland, many of which are in Dunfermline actually, around residential areas, and I've included these pictures here on screen just to show how diverse some of these are. So on the top left here, some of them are temporary water basins or like a swale channel, which means when they're dry at some point in the year, they transform in these very beautiful wildflower-rich areas. And some of them are permanently wet. I think these are actually the same pictures, the same SUDS that Craig had in his presentations. But I just want to highlight the diversity of the vegetation around the SUD as well. So this is me in the field with the beautiful SUDS just behind me in Glasgow. I'm sampling pollinators using pan traps. So these are essentially just colored balls, and the different pollinators are attracted to different colors, and they just fly straight in the trap. I leave these water pan traps out for about 6 hours to kind of capture that morning and noon activity. And this is a regular day of sampling on the bottom here. So you can see actually most hoverflies here are attracted to yellow. So because adult hoverflies depend on nectar and pollen, this highlights the importance of what Craig said in terms of providing larval habitat and adult habitat as well. So of course I'm surveying all of the flowers at my sites, but I'm also surveying things like the vegetation at each site. I'm measuring things like sediment type, water chemistry, physical characteristics as well of the SUDS, like slope and shading and really everything around the SUDS at the local scale. But we know that pollinators don't just respond to that localized scale. It's the landscape context also matters. So they're influenced by that broader landscape. So for that, I'm looking at different land uses in different relevant buffer areas in 250 meters, 500 meters, 1 kilometer, and so on. So for example, I'm looking at the percentage of urban cover in that buffer area or agricultural cover in that buffer area. So this will help me answer 2 questions, 2 key questions. What do pollinators need at the site level, just very localized, but also how or what makes a SUD well placed within that landscape and just to add real biodiversity value. So this is just something very interesting that happened while I was surveying my site. So I've put these cards out here just saying this is a research project. I was actually just hoping that they don't get vandalized by the public. And they have this QR code. It takes you to a website I made where I explain more about the research. And actually, I've had some unexpected emails from the local communities, and they showed a lot of interest in the research. And they said, as a resident who is deeply invested in making the area I live in better for wildlife and protecting what's already living here, I'm really excited and energized to see that there is research being done here. And I hope you find our little ponds at each area of study. This particular pond wasn't very rich, but I was very excited to have that sort of enthusiasm. So they've actually approached me to seek out my support in writing to their local authority to stop the very intensive mowing regimes. So they were mowing multiple times per year, and as you can tell, there were no flowers at the site. It didn't look as good as it could anyway, and now that I have been at the site again twice this year, I can confirm that they did stop mowing, at least inside that fenced area of the SUD, they stopped mowing, which is just a wonderful example of just people regaining that stewardship. And sometimes they just need a bit of encouragement to be proactive in changing a regime at their SUD. So in this, I won't get into this in too much detail because I don't have time, but just to show what's possible to do at the SUDS for insect research. So for the larvae that I've mentioned, these are the rat-tailed maggots of the dronefly. I've installed artificial egg-laying sites at some of the SUDS, and they're essentially just buckets of decaying vegetation and water. I've left them at the site for about six to 7 months, and hoverflies oviposit inside, the larvae emerge, and they allow me to kind of evaluate the recruitment rate at the SUD. Essentially saying like how quickly hoverflies colonize a SUD. And I'm also measuring heavy metal concentrations in the sediment at each SUD, so basically assessing the ecological risk. So Craig mentioned that yes, SUDs are designed to capture pollutants and to manage flood risk, but we don't really understand how do these pollutants further on affect wildlife. And what we're finding is already very high level of arsenic and lead in the sediment. So we want to understand how they move up the food chain, or even if they move at all. So of course I'm looking at sediment, I'm looking at flower heads, and ultimately at the hoverflies themselves. So I'm not going to show any intricate results because I'm still collecting data for this year. But just to say that over last year's seasons, I've collected over 500 hoverflies and recorded over 200 bees. And I just want to show the life that's happening at the SUDS without us noticing very often. So look at the diversity of hoverfly species here, and even these translucid roundworms. Very diverse spider communities. I've just included the crab spider protecting her egg sac, and we have amphibians using the site, and lots and lots and lots of dragonflies and damselflies flying around. So maybe we can have another webinar next year to show you the actual evidence for pollinators, but just I think this is very relevant for planning. So I just wanted to say, from what I see so far at the landscape level, I have a very positive effect of local header, and that's talking just within 250 meters from the SUD. Very positive effect on hoverflies, and positive effect of suburban habitat within 1 kilometer. And I think what's happening here is just high floral rewards from people's gardens, probably just planting different species, and that supports pollinators. But a negative impact of improved grassland and urban habitat. And in terms of the local scale here, so we see a positive effect of floral richness. Of course, I would expect that, but a negative effect of shade and vegetation richness. And I think that's because if the vegetation gets too rich, if reeds get too rich, for example, like anything else, it can suffocate the floral richness. It suffocates the flowers. They can't really emerge. You just have lots of reeds dominating the entire SUD. And also, oh yes, a management effect as well. So I think what's going on here, this is council-owned SUDs as opposed to privately managed SUDs. So this ties into the problem of who's actually responsible for SUDS management once it gets put into place. And here, private SUDs don't tend to get mowed simply because the developer doesn't mow once the SUDS is put in place. The SUDS is left to be, but the council mows quite often. And here I see a negative effect of council management. And just to say, these 4 plants in particular came up as beneficial for hoverflies, and all of them, of course, native, very rich in nectar, and that's knapweed, oxeye daisy, bramble, and red clover. I also just want to highlight that from our human perspective, all of them are technically weeds. We consider them as weeds, but maybe that needs to change as well. And another informative graph, just to quickly say, when we look at whether a SUDS is wet all year around or just seasonally wet and sometimes dry throughout the year, for both hoverflies and for bees, the numbers are much higher in permanently wet SUDS compared to seasonal ones. So the final impact here for my PhD, we are going to be working with Nature Scot to ensure that the findings will feed directly into the pollinator strategy for Scotland I mentioned earlier, and that's essentially to inform the decisions around urban green infrastructures. And we will also map the contributions of the SUDS to this broader network. So basically identify weak points and strongholds in the SUDS network to be able to make more active and on-site decisions for invertebrate conservation. So what I wanted to mention is also I've just showed some of the results here, but the management of the SUDS will most likely vary massively. So this is the situation to my SUDS in the central belt of Scotland, but the situation the needs of the SUDS in, I don't know, Inverness might be completely different. So we need that very localized assessment for the SUDS needs, but also to integrate SUDS into a wider network so that we actually contribute to the regional biodiversity. So final thoughts. When we think about it, urbanization is not going to go away. But if we design and we manage the SUDS in a way that, with biodiversity in mind, we have a real chance to contribute to that regional biodiversity and actually enhance ecosystem resilience in urban spaces where it lacks at the moment. And I also just wanted to say, if you've seen some of the SUDS you recognized in your local area, or you're just curious about your local SUDS, I would be very happy if you get in touch with me to discuss the needs of your local SUDS specifically, and see if we can do something, especially for pollinators. It's not much effort, and it could just mean writing to our local authority to manage around the SUDS better. Thank you.
Wow, that's fabulous. Thank you very much. If somebody could put your contact details into the chat, that would be really helpful, Andrada. Nikki, do you want me to do the questions? Are you okay for me to carry on, or would you like to? Yep, okay. We've had three very good questions come in. One that sort of follows on a little bit from what you were saying, Andrada, and what I was saying at the end of the last talk, that we were hoping that Craig might sort of also explain how communities can get involved in different ways. But Richard is saying that there's a proposed development in Lochgelly who want to locate their SUDS in a common good area, which is Lochgelly Public Park, instead of their own land. And Fife Council are actually in favour of this. And do you think that SUDS are viable in popular public areas like this? And how might a community have input into the design of the SUDS to create biodiversity? So if you could maybe speak to that, and then we'll go on to the next one.
Sure. I definitely think that they could be viable in that sort of area. It depends what type of SUDS you put in there. As I showed in my presentation, there's a whole different range of SUDS that you could install. The example I showed at the end of the constructed wetland in Grangemouth is in a public park, so it's quite possible to have it in a public area. They don't have to be fenced off. They don't have to be big holes in the ground with water in. It depends on the size of the development in Lochgelly. Whether if it's a large development, it may need to hold water. But if it's a smaller development, it may be able to have one of the wet, dry SUDS. On how does the community council have input into the design of the SUDS? I think that when there's a new development proposed, and there's the initial, I've forgotten the term for it, is it PAN notice, or I can't remember what it's called. Anyway, the proposal of an application, get involved at that stage, ask to see the plans, ask to understand the master plan for the area if it's a bigger development, work out where they're putting the SUDS, and then have that dialogue then to see that they are taking into account biodiversity in the design. It actually links into the one above that from Stephen about mosquito larvae. So as Andrada showed there, these SUDS can be really diverse. You can have amphibians, you can have newts and toads and frogs and the like. You can have birds around them. You can have dragonflies and damselflies. And the more that you can encourage that sort of wildlife, the more in balance the whole ecosystem will be. And it means that the mosquitoes will actually be kept under control. Mosquitoes can survive in very polluted water and in stagnant water. But it's a bit of a misconception that all SUDS are polluted. Some of these are purely for surface water. They're picking up some road salts and the like. But generally, when I was learning as an engineer, we were told that dilution is the solution to pollution. So the more, as they get more water into them, there's less, the concentration of these chemicals is less, and things can survive in them. I've seen in developments in Kinnaird Village that I showed examples there. I've seen all sorts around there, and there's not really a problem with mosquitoes. There's probably more mosquitoes in your gutters if you've not cleaned your gutters for a while. They will go into any sort of source of water that's hanging around. I don't know if you want to add anything on that, Andrada.
Not on this necessarily, Craig. I just meant to say that how people can get engaged into this. So once the SUDS gets put into place, that just becomes part of your residential area. And what I would like to see at the local SUDS in the residential areas is, like you said, panels of just telling people what it is. I've spoken with so many locals, and they had no idea that a SUD is a SUD. They see a pond, but they don't know that the primary function of their pond is essentially pollution management and management for flood risk. They don't know that this is the number one priority. And of course, they want to see more wildlife. Of course, they want to see biodiversity increase at their site, but that will be limited by these other factors. And on one hand, it's amazing that the SUD is doing what it's supposed to do with capturing these pollutants. We don't quite understand yet how that impacts wildlife further.
That's great, and we've got a sort of follow-up question to that in somebody who's actually looking for help to design a SUDS at Polmont. You know, and if you're trying to influence a big developer like Carla, you know, how do you get advice on what they should actually be doing? It might refer back to some of the guidance, perhaps. Is that good enough, or are there better things to be looking at?
So the Pullman SUDS, I'm not sure if that's part of a larger development or if it's a local sort of like small SUDS. I would have a look at the SUDS guidance from Syria. Have a look at more generally pond guidance. You know, there's some great resources out there about how to design a wildlife pond. Like I say, that you know, designing it as a wildlife pond. And then thinking about what the engineering tweaks you have to do to you know, in this case it might be that you need an overflow so that the water overflows back into the drainage system once it's been through the pond. So again, I think it's looking at that guidance. And what was the other question? Oh, Dakala. So yeah, so that a large development that's done by somebody like Cala or Persimmons or that will probably be part of a much bigger development. So you really need to be looking at what's coming up in the master plan for the area and then influence at that stage. Once they're into the design, they're probably already fixed on what they're going to do. If you can, there are, as I went through in my talk, there are certain things, and Andrada mentioned it as well, you know, like a variety of depths in the pond so that it can dry out in places so you can have those sort of muddy edges and things. Shallow slopes into the shallow profile and aspect, scalloped edges so that you've got sort of like more complexity in the water body as well, are all things. Marginal vegetation, managing the banks and the surrounding area for wildlife are all really easy things to put into the design of these.
Yeah, thanks. We know sometimes it can be a little bit challenging, especially if you can't actually see some of those designs at the early stage. We know there are a few challenges with that, but that's what I hope some of your work with Nature, Scott, and our work with planning, you know, will help to sort of overcome some of these barriers to people being able to actually input their ideas into designs, especially when it comes to big house builders. Yes, and I think there's some evidence of that in the chat as well. But thank you for that helpful comment from Catherine to Richard about contacting the Fife Biodiversity Coordinator there in Fife. There's another one coming as well just now with a proposed housing development at the edge of our village, subject to localised flooding, assuming the developers will be required to include a SUDS, and how would we as a local community council ensure that the developers design it well, and they actually do what they're going to do, which comes into perhaps whether or not they're conditioning SUDS, perhaps putting it in conditions. I don't know if you've got anything to say about that.
They will be required to do a SUDS because that is the law under the whichever one it was, the Water Environment and Water Services Act. So they will have to consider the surface water flooding in their plans. How do you ensure that developers design an environmentally friendly SUDS? Make the point in the planning process. Make sure, or if there's an opportunity beforehand, contact the developer and ask them to consider the things that we've brought up, the two of us have brought up. How do you ensure that they actually do what they're going to do? That's going to be planning conditions. That's got to be part of the conditioning of the planning application.
Can I just add something on that, Craig? I'm not sure whether the environmental friendly practices we've mentioned are part of that, or is it just the water management that they need to monitor? Because I'm not convinced, I'm not sure whether they have any biodiversity monitoring in place during that. And as an ecologist, as an ecologist from my side, it would be adaptive management, so ongoing monitoring and adaptive management as you go. But I don't think that happens.
No, I think this is more about how do you make sure that what they say they're going to install is what they actually install, and they don't just go, actually, we're not going to do all that biodiversity stuff. We're just going to put the engineering in. So I think that you're right, though, that monitoring's an interesting one because the outflow of these SUDS aren't checked. They're not monitored. They're not, so they're not actually checked to see if they are actually making a difference to the water quality. That will be checked in the river at some point downstream by SEPA, but the actual efficacy of these systems isn't checked in any way. In the same way that biodiversity monitoring isn't done unless it's done by communities. And there's lots of ways that you can. There's lots of citizen science methods that you can use to monitor the sort of things that Andrada's been talking about. There's flower insect time counts, which you can do, which is a really simple 10-minute thing. You sit down with an area marked off on a piece of flowering vegetation, so it could be daisies, it could be ragwort, it could be anything. Mark the area, and you just count how many insects come to it, different types of insects come to it. And then that all goes in and feeds back to the pollinator strategy and the like as well. So there are things that you can do as a community to monitor SUDS, but there's no checking, if you like, official checking to see that they're actually operating correctly, unless they're causing a major pollution incident, of course. Everybody will know about it.
Well, thank you. Well, I'd like to finish up on a great idea from Joe about communities adopting a local SUDS, and I think that's a great idea that we could perhaps get local councils to agree to, yeah, a very positive way of perhaps getting communities involved in the management.
Maybe championing rather than adopting. Adopting's got a very particular meaning in terms of SUDS, which means that you take on all responsibilities for managing the engineering. You don't want to take that on as a community.
Yes, that does sound a little bit challenging. Okay, well, that was a fascinating and excellent talk from Andrada and Craig. So thank you so much for spending the time. Yeah, maybe watch this space. Maybe we'll have an in-person event with Andrada maybe next summer, or an appropriate time to help people learn a little bit more about monitoring and ongoing maintenance issues if people are up for that. So thank you all for coming. Have a good evening and goodbye.